over to you.
All right, thank you, Dan. It is my great pleasure to introduce Michael Ruehle, who is currently the head of Hybrid Challenges and Energy Security Section at NATO. But he already had a considerable amount of experience as an analyst, speaker, and writer under his belt before joining NATO's international staff in 1991. Previously, he was head of speech writing in NATO's Political Affairs Division and senior political advisor in the NATO Secretary General's Policy Planning Unit. In these positions, he wrote speeches and articles for 6 secretaries general. You can imagine that that would have been on a wide variety of topics, and I have always been impressed. I've heard him a number of times by his ability to analyze very complex issues and to address them, speak about them in a very succinct, clear way for all of us to understand. Now I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be, at least virtually, at this event of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. When I was told a few months ago that I would have to look more into climate change as one of the additional jobs in my job at the Emerging Security Challenges Division, I was initially a bit skeptical. I thought it was sort of a punishment for me because, after all, as Julie just said, I was a speechwriter for 19 years for 6 secretaries general. So imagine all the hot air that I have produced. So I'm guilty, at least partially, of climate change, and now I have to repent and do it better. But then the second thought was, of course, no, this is a subject that is of unbelievable importance. It's something that no institution can stand idly by, and each institution has to look into ways to help solving this problem. Now, climate change is seen by the majority of the population of Western industrialized countries as the greatest threat. It ranks far before cyber attacks, before international terrorism, you name it. And it's easy to see why. And I can be very brief here because Jonathan Quinn has already quite well, I think, laid out the problem. Let me just say that rising global temperatures will lead to a rise in sea levels, will increasingly cause extreme weather events such as storms, floods, droughts, forest fires. So we don't have to dwell at length on why climate change is a problem. It's still quite difficult, I would argue, to establish a causal link between environmental change and conflict. We often do that sort of offhandish. It's not quite so easy. But I think if climate change, as Jonathan Quinn has also outlined very eloquently, if climate change will lead to food and water shortages, if it will lead to pandemics, mass migration, and humanitarian disasters of all kinds, it will over time aggravate existing conflicts and perhaps even spark new ones. I think it's almost a no-brainer. Now, NATO is not the primary addressee when it comes to climate change. This role, of course, has to be played by institutions that can set limits on CO2 emissions, for example. But as a transatlantic security and defense organization, NATO is a key forum for discussing the security implications of climate change. And in addition, through its numerous committees, agencies, and so on, NATO deals with many non-military security issues that are relevant to the climate dossier. In fact, NATO has been addressing the effects of climate change for many, many years and in many different ways. Since the 1970s, for example, we've been setting environmental protection standards for certain military activities. We have been funding climate-related research for decades, and we have made considerable progress in enhancing the energy efficiency in the military, for example, by reducing the consumption of fossil fuel in military camps through the integration of renewables like wind and solar. We have also considerable experience in responding to humanitarian disasters, whether they're climate induced or not. For example, in the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, NATO delivered 3,500 tons of supplies to the crisis region. And in other natural disasters, such as floods in allied countries, in partner countries, NATO coordinated national contributions so that they would have the most effect. Now, we are also conducting consequence management field exercises with allies and with partner countries. And some of the scenarios of these exercises are based on environmental challenges. The idea of these exercises is to strengthen the ability of teams from different nations to cooperate across a wide range of relief operations. This involves, for example, urban search and rescue, emergency medical teams, decontamination teams, and the like. So all this makes a higher profile of NATO on climate change not just conceivable. I think it makes it desirable. It also fits into the logic of other initiatives, such as the European Union with its Green Deal, for example, which aims to make the Union carbon neutral by 2015. And as we just heard, Canada has very similar goals. Now, one should be wary of exaggeration as we make the transition to a future that is powered by more sustainable forms of energy. Armed forces will continue to consume large amounts of fossil fuel. And that's why a new NATO approach to climate change should never downplay NATO's most important contribution to security, which is the prevention of military conflict through collective military power. Military security and environmental security are both of existential importance. You should not play them off against each other. That said, I think NATO can and should demonstrate that it takes environmental concerns into account and that our armed forces are more than just innocent bystanders to the climate debate. So what does this mean in concrete terms? What is NATO's role when it comes to meeting the challenge of climate change? Basically, I see three major areas. The first is, of course, awareness. As I said before, NATO is the key transatlantic platform for allies to identify, to monitor, to discuss the security implications of climate change. And that's why we need to integrate climate aspects into our security risk assessments. We need to conduct more systematic foresight efforts to get a handle on climate change. We must leverage the existing research, science and technology programs that we have to support research on the impact of climate change on allied security. We must also increase our awareness of region-specific climate vulnerabilities, in particular the Arctic, which some people believe is the epicenter of climate change. And we must analyze what climate change means for other actors, say for Russia and China, one being an Arctic littoral state, another one being very interested in Arctic issues. Simply put, we must understand climate change as a phenomenon that will shape every single aspect of our strategic environment. My second point is adaptation. Climate change makes it harder for our militaries to keep our people safe. NATO troops are often exposed to the world's most hazardous and difficult environments on land, sea, desert, jungle, whether engaged in combat operations or training or disaster relief. For instance, in Iraq, where NATO has a training mission, as you know, temperatures in Baghdad last summer soared above 50 degrees centigrade. Just imagine being in that heat, let alone wearing full combat gear. It quickly becomes impossible for anybody to function. And it's not only people that don't work properly in extremes, it's of course equipment as well. In Afghanistan, for example, allies had to replace some of their helicopter engines because they simply couldn't cope with the heat. In the maritime domain, we have seen that the climate-induced change in the salinity of water affects the engines of certain warships. But climate change doesn't just affect how we operate, it also affects where we operate. As a threat multiplier to the security environment, the consequences of climate change, as I said earlier, are likely to be a driver of instability, and it will cause further natural disasters. So it will create situations which will continue to require military intervention, as well as the need for us to provide assistance to the civil authorities In addition, much of our critical infrastructure is exposed. For example, the US naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, which is home to one of our strategic commands, is suffering regularly from extensive flooding. And major European ports, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, all face similar challenges. So to remain effective, we have to adapt to the situation. This means combat gear, vehicles, equipment, infrastructure that can protect troops. It means incorporating climate change into our defense planning process and into our exercises. We already work with our 30 member countries across Europe and North America to better prepare them for shocks to things like energy, food, and water supplies. We do this through guidelines on how to be more resilient. We call them resilience baseline requirements. We need to look at how we can further strengthen these guidelines to fully take climate change into account. For example, to ensure that our energy or telecommunication grids can withstand more extreme weather events. And we need to strengthen our ability to respond to natural disasters. We have a disaster response center that brings many nations together and has brought many nations together, for example, recently in the face of COVID-19. We've delivered hundreds of tons of critical supplies around the world. We set up almost 100 field hospitals, and we were transporting patients and medical personnel. So just as we've supported national governments during COVID-19, we can also be prepared to do more in relation to climate-related disasters. Climate change must also be reflected in our partnerships. Climate change, as you can imagine, affects many of our partner countries. Many of them will be actually more vulnerable to climate change than most of us, if you think of Northern Africa, for example. And they will certainly be interested in working with us on scientific cooperation, on mitigation measures, for example, but also on consequence management, on training and education. We've already done such things, for example, concerning flood control in Ukraine and desertification in Egypt. We can do more. We should also do more in helping partner countries build the capacity and the resilience to better manage the impact of climate change on their own. Now, the third and final dimension is mitigation. Climate change happens largely because we burn fossil fuel. So that's why we all have a responsibility to cut emissions. And the military will not be an exception. And I think it was made very clear by the first speaker this evening, or this afternoon in your case. And now, fortunately, there are technologies out there that allow us to do this without losing military effectiveness. In other words, there are technologies out there that could deliver what we call win-win outcomes. Take the supply of fuel as an example. It has always been a very critical, difficult, and sometimes very dangerous part of military operations. Fuel supply lines, if you think of Pakistan into Afghanistan, notoriously vulnerable. Long fuel convoys are a tempting target. And as I mentioned earlier, NATO, together with our Center of Excellence on Energy Security, has been running projects, therefore, to reduce the use of fossil fuel in military camps by bringing in wind and solar. And many allies have been conducting experiments with biofuel, with special paint to reduce the water drag on the hull of warships, and of course with LEDs and other things to reduce electricity consumption in military installations. The United States, Canada are two countries that are looking, for example, at integrating solar panels into the combat gear to power the increasing amount of electronic equipment that a soldier today has to carry. Other NATO countries are experimenting with hydrogen fuel cells with batteries that are particularly effective to store more electricity. All this is done not in the first place because of environmental reasons. It is done for practical military reasons, because the more energy efficient we become, the less we need to rely on vulnerable fuel supply chains, and the better our mission endurance. If you want to reduce military emissions, we first need to know how much fuel we actually consume. In other words, we need to undertake a major mapping exercise that would establish some baseline numbers we could then work with. This is going to be a challenging thing, but at the end, I think such a mapping exercise will happen because it's going to be worth it. Last month, NATO foreign ministers agreed a so-called NATO agenda for climate change and security, which contains many of the ideas that I just shared with you. We are now working on a more detailed so-called action plan, which we hope will be agreed in time for our summit in mid-June. Among the highlights of that summit will be the Secretary General's so-called NATO 2030 initiative. It's an initiative that seeks to make NATO more united politically, more capable militarily, and more connected globally. Meeting the challenge of climate change will form one important part of this NATO 2030 initiative, because it demonstrates that when it comes to global challenges such as climate change, NATO will not just be an innocent bystander, but an alliance that actually takes action. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with a little anecdote that I like very much. In Molière's play Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, the protagonist gets an explanation on the difference between poetry and prose. And to his surprise and his delight, he realizes that he had been speaking prose all his life. He just didn't know it. So when it comes to NATO and climate change, we resemble the character in Molière's play. We have been working on environmental protection standards, supported scientific cooperation on climate change, on water security, and what have you. We've tested smart energy technologies long before the term climate change started to dominate the headlines. So in other words, we were speaking prose long before the poetry was put on top of it. And this bodes well for NATO's ability to play its part in meeting what is probably mankind's greatest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for a very clear explanation. Your very specific examples have been very helpful, I think, in making it clear just what we are dealing with. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what is the greatest difficulty or the challenge that NATO itself faces in dealing with all this. You've given us some excellent examples of how NATO can bring people together and do things, but what is one of the, or some of the greatest challenges that NATO itself is experiencing?
That's an excellent question, Julie. The first challenge, of course, is we all come from different starting points. You have countries that have dealt with climate change in many different ways, partially because of geography, Canada being a case in point. We have other countries, and Canada is a fairly rich country. We have also countries, though, that have not dealt with climate change so much because they have not been affected that much yet, and which may not be as rich and may not have the kind of military establishment that Canada or other countries have. Take the example of some of our newer allies in Central Eastern Europe. Some of them even operate still Soviet legacy equipment. You can't just go to these countries and say that stuff is too dirty, throw it away and buy some clean new stuff. That's simply not possible. That is overtaxes these countries economically. So for what sounds good for some countries, what sounds modern and hip, to be fully into the climate change story, may sound for other countries like a financial burden, which for them is almost impossible to shoulder. So we need to make sure that we all sing from the same song sheet. And this means that we need to bring all allies along. And that will require, I think, a little bit more work. We are right in the middle of that. We're working on the action plan for the summit. And we need to make sure that no ally feels sort of, in a straitjacket that other allies build around him. That's one thing. The second is, of course, indeed making NATO the platform for bringing these win-win technologies together. Many of these win-win technologies have been tested, have been developed, but on a national basis. And so bringing energy efficient equipment together and make it interoperable is a huge challenge. We've worked on some small scale projects like camps, energy in camps. One is led by Canada, for example. And we started really from scratch because the military usually doesn't measure how much fuel it consumes and therefore how much many emissions it produces, because usually the military has all the fuel that it needs, to put it very bluntly. So you first have to start measuring so that you can compare different allies, and then you can draw your conclusions on what they can do to perhaps minimize the fossil fuel consumption. And the third point, again, in the interoperability business, we have a fuel policy at NATO which is based on interoperability. In other words, we try to make sure that when, let's say, a Canadian a piece of Canadian equipment comes to Europe, we will have fuel that will work for this whatever Canadian piece of equipment it will be. So when, assuming Canada would suddenly change its fuel policy and say we want to have cleaner fuel, then it creates an interoperability problem probably for the allies in Europe who want to supply this Canadian equipment once it arrives in Europe. So we need to look very carefully at the bottom line, what is really useful for the environment, but what is also useful for our interoperability, because I would say interoperability is one of our most precious assets. That's what makes NATO the gold standard of international military cooperation. So we don't want to lose that in the process as we try to become greener.
Thank you very much for that response, Michael. I wonder if you could also explain a little bit more how the Centers for Excellence work in NATO, because you mentioned the one that is looking at climate opportunities right now.
In fact, yes, Centers of Excellence, we have almost 30 of those. Are military, international military organizations. They are a little bit like think tanks, you could say. The one that I was mentioning was the Center of Excellence on Energy Security that was established in 2012 in Vilnius in Lithuania. And it started very early on to look at technologies to reduce fuel consumption, particularly in camps. It has done all kinds of tests. It even brought a huge piece of equipment once to Canada to test it in cold climate. I never understood it because I thought Lithuania is pretty cold, but apparently Canada is even colder. So they tried it there. And it's a very Centers of Excellence are very, very useful resource, because they are like, as I said, like think tanks. They're like coalitions of the willing, because each COE has it's run by, let's say, 10, 12 states. So not all allies are in each of these COEs. On climate change, we don't have a dedicated COE yet. In fact, several allies are likely, I think, to step forward, even perhaps putting several allies together in developing a COE. Canada is certainly, in my view, a natural candidate, given that it is a country very much affected by climate change and is already doing a lot about it. But there are others as well, so we'll see. But for us, it is very useful because a COE is because it's a coalition and it's not very bureaucratic. It can make progress in ways a slightly clumsier NATO consensus-driven apparatus is not always capable of doing.
Thank you for that, Michael. In a paper that you wrote, you also mentioned the work of the NATO Science for Peace and Security program and the research project. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, how that works, and how perhaps some of these many groups that David was talking about might be able to contribute to or access that program?
Yes, indeed. NATO's Science for Peace and Security program, it exists for a long, long time. It had some different names, but I think initially it was called the Committee for the Challenges of Modern Societies. I think it was established in the late 60s or early 70s. It's part of our division, the Emerging Security Challenges division. So we have a scientific toolbox, if you will. which comes in very handy for on many occasions. Basically, it's a program that sponsors scientific research that is security relevant. Each application has to be vetted by allies, so only if all 30 agree will this go forward. What we are trying to do now, we want to look more into climate change as a security challenge that is of deep concern to allies, and look how we can maximize the use of SPS, Science for Peace and Security, to sponsor research in that area. As I said before, since the 70s we're doing that, but I think we can do this in an even more focused way. And we also do now more what we call top-down projects. In other words, we ourselves, the staff, gets together and we think about, where are the gaps in our knowledge in terms of climate change, and then we can see how can we formulate, for example, an application for scientists, and then have scientists apply for a project that would solve the riddle that we have formulated. And so that would help NATO, I think, to have a broader situational awareness when it comes to climate change. So we want to steer this SPS program stronger towards climate change and related environmental security issues, because we think it has an enormous potential. And climate change, of course, is an issue that affects partner countries very much, as I said in my remarks. It is one of the trademarks of the Science for Peace and Security program that it is always a partner country and at least one allied country together that can apply for a project. So let's say a Canadian professor and a Swedish professor can come together and propose a research project because it would be an ally and a partner country. So this is also, it has a very strong partner dimension, which we also cherish very much. And given, as I said, given that many partner countries are even more vulnerable to climate change than many allies, I think the partner dimension in SPS is very useful indeed.
Thank you, Michael. That's excellent. And I want to thank you for a very clear presentation. I noticed a couple of key points that I thought were particularly good. Your statement that you must not play military and environmental security against each other, I think is a very important point for us to keep in mind, because so often countries are looking at their priorities and they say, we need so much money for this, and therefore we have to drop that. But we have to look at ways in which whatever we do in one area can benefit the other area as well. And the other thing that stands out, of course, is the ability, the experience that NATO has in getting people to work together, not only the interoperability of equipment, but also the understanding and the extended networks. So thank you again for your presentation. There will be opportunities again at the end of the session if anybody is thinking of another question for Michael. And in the meantime, we'll take a short break. It's a 5-minute break only, just to give us a chance to stretch our legs. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.